Hi, my name is Sydney Pomeranz, and today I'm going to be talking about gender constructs and their effect on globalism and how masculinity affects societal progression as my race and gender final. So let's begin. So I wanted to start by explaining a little bit more about what this topic is. So when we talk about the constructs of masculinity and their effects on globalism, we have to talk about the way that masculinity affects the quality of life. Does it shorten lifespans? Does it cause depression? Does it affect education systems? And leading into that, we have to ask, how do they affect our children? Where do constructs such as sexism and homophobia come from? Are they ingrained from a young age? And what do gender constructs do to the society and the progression that we expect to see from it? Well, let's get into it. So, I want to explain why I chose this topic. First of all, I want to explain my experience. Growing up, I was always expected to be very feminine. I was expected to want to play with Barbies and to want to kind of play with my hair and do makeup and bake and do just very feminine things. And luckily, those were all things I liked. But I also found myself exploring very male dominated fields like STEM and research. And I found that when I started debate, I started to recognize that the rules of masculinity in my life were very similar to the rules of masculinity on a global scale. And so, understanding that, I decided what would be best for me was to maybe explore that more and understand how that affected people just like me all over the world, as well as how society progresses. Because I feel like ever since I started high school, I've seen a lot of conversations around the men in history and the way that they've shaped what we've come to know now. And there are a lot of unfortunate things in history. So, knowing that, I wanted to make a couple goals going into this assignment. One, I want to better understand how gender constructs play into community experiences, meaning how do these kind of expectations that we place on men, women, and children affect our everyday lives? What kind of society does that breed? And next, I want to talk about the consequences of leaving gender binaries unchecked when we force a conversation of only men and only women and make those definitions of femininity and masculinity very hard. What happens? And how do we combat any negative effects of such? Because I didn't really want to leave this essay on a negative note. So here are a couple of my findings. First of all, masculinity affects children's sense of self and performance in gendered fields. So I wanted to start by talking about this study that was conducted that showed when children are exposed to quote unquote gendered fields, it tends to affect their own performance and belief in themselves. And not only that, but young boys tend to play into the expectations placed on them more. And it's believed that this is because young boys are generally told that they're more capable, and therefore it's easier to kind of fall in love with that idea and want it. And when we talk about gendered fields, we mean things like STEM. And these kids were shown examples of like male dominated fields. And then they were shown that same field, but only female and women in it and made it feminine. And then they kind of combined the two and looked at the effects and found that when you force that kind of expectation on children, it affects the way that they see themselves. The second thing I learned was that we are very much so still a sexist society. And what I mean by that is that there was a study done that showed that when adolescents are still very malleable and are still constantly being exposed to new constructs, sexism is bred into their expectations. We live in a cis heteropatriarchy, this expectation that everybody fits into what you want it to be. And even when you're trying to fight that, it's really hard because this study goes into explaining how everything in life is gendered and there's so many different expectations in what you do. For example, the differences in toy aisles and men's versus women clothes and men's versus women's products and things that are seen as masculine jobs versus feminine jobs, how boys play with fire trucks and girls play with Barbie dolls. They're designed to be ingrained from a young age. And this study went on to find that when left unchecked, this can lead to higher rates of violence, homophobia, and a lack of acceptance towards gender nonconformity. Next, I found that men are more prone to nightmares when they show a negative correlation to femininity. And I want to break this down a little bit more because it's not just nightmares. It also tends to be something that we see a lot in the expectations of masculinity. There's been a couple studies that I reported on in my paper that kind of showed how the expectations placed on men lead to a lack of understanding for the experiences of being a man. Meaning that when men experience things like domestic partner violence, it's not taken as seriously as it is when women experience things of the same caliber. And knowing that, I think it's really important that we take this information and we kind of combat it, but I'll get into that later in my presentation. But what this study showed was that men tend to have lower rates of positive mental health, higher rates of suicide, they die earlier, they tend to get sick more often, and they tend to have more nightmares. And this second study that I want to bring up, Gay Men Are Less Avoidant of Feminine Media, kind of explains why. It happens to be that in this study it's gay men specifically, but the issue I take with that is that they kind of ignore the many other sexualities and gendered experiences that exist outside of just being a gay man. But knowing that, they took this idea of what feminine media is, what kind of experiences women go through, and check to see the way that men existed when they were more avoidant of it. And they found that men who were more avoidant of it tended to have worse mental health and all of those awful things that I talked about. And it's believed that that is because that refusal of femininity leads to a lack of emotional expression, and even physical pain expression is less seen in typically masculine men, which leads to lower mental health rates because those things aren't talked about. So the gaps in these studies were that they failed to address the effects of limiting gender to a binary and an overly prevalent femininity aspect of society. So first of all of these essays strictly talked about men and women, and only one of them talked about the idea of gender nonconformity, and it was only in the sense that when you introduce children to it, they are less skeptical and abrasive towards it. My issue with this is that we don't really get to see how these gender expectations affect those who are non-binary or transgender, and I'm sure there's studies out there that do kind of explore it. My issue is that I had a hard time finding specifically articles that talked about the way that these kids kind of, how that affects children specifically, how forcing binaries onto children can affect education and socioeconomic rates and overall just societal progression. And, you know, we see a lot of these issues with a cis heteropatriarchy, but what would happen if it was a cis heteromatriarchy instead? Just because something is the opposite doesn't automatically make it better, but I didn't see a lot of articles talking about that. So, in conclusion, I want to see more studies that observe the effects on children that are raised in matriarchal situations or overly feminine situations, or even ideas that like lack genderism as a whole, or rather embrace gender as a spectrum. And one of the articles that I found talked about a praxis of critical race love and argued that it's currently the best solution to break down the issues of a cis heteropatriarchy and just this expectation that they went into two main things, and one was the idea that sometimes issues are so big that trying to fight it creates a scenario in which you cannot stand up for other issues. So, for example, they took a group of Latina teachers and found that they were so busy fighting the sexism on their shoulders that they tended to let go of the more racist issues in their lives because it gets so boggled down that you have to pick between which one you want to fight for. And then they also talked about in different studies what different countries looked like on a global scale, how different countries were globally trying to fix the issues that are associated with a strictly patriarchal society. And what was brought forth was called the praxis of critical race love, which basically talks about early intervention in youth, talking about how brief intervention and basically just educating children is the best way to lower rates of homophobia, racism, violence, and even later in life, domestic partner abuse. And the important part about that critical race aspect is it allows you to deal with other aspects of um, marginality, such as racism, while still breaking down gender constructs as a whole. So I hope this helps you understand a little bit more about how I spent my time during my race and gender class, and thank you very much for watching.